Good day. As those of you who follow my programs might have noticed from my video yesterday, I have been having a bad cold, and I'm afraid it's now affected my larynx, and I'm therefore going to keep this video very short. Tomorrow's video, I hope, will be of a more normal length. This video, I'm going to focus on two issues, which is firstly the decision of the International Court of Justice in the case that South Africa brought against Israel, and the other is that I'm going to touch on the issue in the United States involving the conflict between Texas and the federal authorities, and I'm going to discuss what the impact of that might be on the situation in Ukraine. I am not going to discuss military developments either in Ukraine or in the Middle East. As it happens, we are in a period where there is less news about those military developments. So it's actually a good moment not to have to talk about them. I suspect that by tomorrow, there will be an awful lot more to discuss there, which I will, of course, do. Right, let's go straight to the decision of the International Court of Justice. And I think I will say straight away, and first of all, that for Israel, this was just about the toughest and most unsatisfactory decision that Israel could have received. Now, in the media here in Britain, media publications that have tended to take a pro-Israeli line since the start of the conflict in Gaza have seized on the fact that the International Court of Justice did not order a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, it made perfect sense for South Africa when it made its application to the International Court of Justice to ask the International Court of Justice to order a ceasefire in Gaza, and it made equal sense for the International Court of Justice to refuse that request. And I'm just going to explain why. Firstly, South Africa is alleging that a genocide is underway in Gaza. Given that that is the allegation, the claim that South Africa is making, it would have been illogical for South Africa not to seek an injunction from the International Court of Justice requiring a ceasefire in Gaza, requiring that Israel observe a ceasefire in Gaza. By contrast, for the International Court of Justice, after they have made a ruling saying that there is a prima facie case that Israel might be undertaking a genocide in Gaza, it would have been a step too far for them to make an order for a ceasefire. Doing so would have been consistent with the finding of fact that a genocide was actually underway. And as the International Court of Justice has not done that, and as realistically it could not do that after just 2 weeks of litigation and 2 days of hearing, ordering a ceasefire in Gaza would have prejudged the outcome of the entire case, which is still underway, and weakened the weight of the judgment we have now. So the International Court of Justice was, in my opinion, right in legal terms not to make such an order. But that does not detract from every other part of its decision, which is that it now does accept that there is a prima facie case of genocide. It has given a string of orders that Israel has a month to comply with, instructing Israel to take certain steps that, in order to prevent a genocide being committed. And of course, if Israel doesn't take those steps or doesn't report to the International Court of Justice to explain what it is doing in order to carry out those steps, then going forward, the court is entitled to take that failure by Israel as further evidence that a genocide in Gaza is being committed. So, in all possible respects, this is a heavy defeat for Israel. Now, why has it happened? Well, the South African case was carefully crafted along two facts. The first is Israel's use of what I think even most governments in the West, and certainly most governments around the world, agree is a use of disproportionate force by Israel in Gaza. Now, it is important to understand that the International Court of Justice accepts that Israel has a right of self-defense. It has a right to take action against Hamas. That's why, coming back to my earlier point, it would have been inappropriate for the ICJ, as I will now call it, to order a ceasefire. But the level of force used does appear to be massively disproportionate. Now, proportionality is a fundamental concept in war crimes and human rights law. It's not a very easy concept to pin down and to describe, but given the film, the pictures that have been coming out of Gaza, the reports of tens of thousands of people being killed, the reports that 10,000 of these are minors, children, it would be very difficult to persuade a court that what was happening in Gaza did not at least have the appearance of disproportionality. So already that was a severe problem for the Israelis. However, it was not the main problem. If it had simply been a case that would be determined, that stood to be determined by the actions that Israel was taking in Gaza, because Israel has a right of self-defense, and because Israel can claim that it is only responding to the events that took place on 7th October, when Hamas launched a violent attack upon Israel. If it had just been the events in Gaza, the bombing, the shelling, the attacks on various areas in Gaza, it's possible that the ICJ might have decided that there was a prima facie case, that war crimes were being committed. But it is unlikely that simply on the strength of Israel's actions, it would have concluded that there was a genocide, a prima facie case, that genocide was being perpetrated. What clinched it was these disastrous statements that Israeli ministers and officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, have been making ever since the events of 7th October. Now, I am not going to quote these words. that Israeli officials have used. You can find references to them in the judgment itself and more extensively in the submission made by South Africa to the ICJ. All I will say is they were shocking and they did appear to confirm a genocidal intention. I said appear to confirm because, of course, this case has not yet been fully litigated, and those who have made these statements and these comments can, in theory, come forward and explain that the meaning of these words is not what, on their face, they appear to have. Now, I have to say that I simply do not understand how Israel, which is one of the most sophisticated legal cultures in the world, and which has access throughout the world to the most exceptionally high standard of legal advice, could have made the mistake of it allowing itself the indulgence, of allowing its ministers and officials the indulgence to engage in rhetoric of this sort. Moreover, the Israelis ministers who were doing this, Israeli ministers and officials who were doing this, weren't just doing this prior to South Africa submitting this case to the ICJ. They persisted in doing it even after the case to the ICJ had been submitted. I find it astonishing. It suggests a blind arrogance, an arrogant sense of impunity that is staggering. The South Africans actually touched on that fact in their very submission, where they said that mostly when states set out to perpetrate a genocide, they do it with some element of concealment, whereas Israel, on the contrary, appeared to be going out of its way to broadcast its intentions as it went ahead and did what it was doing in plain view. Just as I do not understand why Israel itself did this, allowed its officials and ministers and all of the others to talk in this astonishing way, I do not understand why the Western governments that have been supporting Israel, which also have access to some of the most outstanding legal advice, didn't come to Israel, to the Israeli government, and advise it to rein in, to stop using this sort of rhetoric. Maybe they were doing that in private, but as we've seen repeatedly over the entire period of this episode, of this conflict, the one which began on the 7th of October, what Western governments say to Israel in private doesn't seem to have any effect. And public statements from the governments of the West would probably have been the only way to rein Israel in, to persuade these Israeli ministers and officials to stop talking in the way that they did. Now, I don't want to act as a lawyer for Israel, acting in hindsight, or a lawyer for Western governments, acting in hindsight. But I don't think much hindsight was needed in this case. I was repeatedly saying in program after program that this rhetoric was both shocking and legally dangerous. And I would have thought that in their own interests, and by the way, in Israel's interests, if they'd properly thought about it, Western governments should have come out and spoken out and told the Israelis to shut up and stop talking in the way that they were. It didn't happen, and that's why we now have the decision that we have. Now, we do now have this decision, and can I just say something else before I proceed? That doing what Prime Minister Netanyahu did, which is making astonishing and shocking statements, terrible statements, like the one that referred to Amalek, and, well, I'm not going to say more about that, and then trying to insert into the same speech a kind of get out of jail clause, saying, well, even though I've just quoted Amalek, we've got to be careful that we don't do things that are inappropriate and wrong. Doing something like that is never going to work against a properly constituted court, certainly not one like the ICJ. It merely will confirm to the court that the person who is making the statement, in this case, Prime Minister Netanyahu, understands that there is a serious problem about the things he's been saying. It will compound the effect of the Amalek comment, not reduce it, at least in legal terms. Anyway, where do we go from here? Israel would be very well advised, in my opinion, to heed the decision of the International Court of Justice. It is a mandatory decision. I would have thought that Israeli officials, the Israeli government, would want to avoid a final finding that Israel is indeed committing genocide. And I've said that non-compliance with orders of the ICJ is far more likely to lead to a finding that Israel is committing genocide than not. Anyway, I would have said that they would be well advised to comply with the order. I would also say that trying to string out the orders, trying to play for time by engaging in tricks, claiming that they're actually observing some parts of the provisions but not others because of all kinds of problems, raising this sort of technical difficulties, the kind of thing that bad lawyers do. Well, again, given the strength of this decision, which it ought to be said was made by a 15-2 majority on the International Court of Justice, doing that, again, is not going to help Israel. It's simply going to make, legally speaking, its position even worse. And if Israel plays that kind of game, either of outright non-compliance or of bad faith compliance, then this case, which some people say might take years to reach a final judgment, might suddenly start to accelerate far more rapidly than Israel and its Western supporters perhaps expect, with the ICJ perhaps concluding that since Israel is clearly showing the most extreme disrespect to the ICJ is left with no alternative than to come to a final decision, fast, a final decision, which in that case could only be a decision that genocide was being committed. So There has to be a change of course. There has to be compliance. And Western governments, if they have two brain cells to rub together, which I sometimes wonder is debatable, I sometimes wonder about, anyway, they would be urging Israel now to do the same thing. I am sorry to say that I doubt that that is what they're going to do. I have already got the sense that Western governments, having taken the position over the course of this case that it was without merit, which was a factually wrong position to take, well, I suspect that Western governments, having previously taken that position, will try to rubbish this decision of the ICJ and will continue to try to protect Israel in the Security Council and in the United Nations. And it is back to the Security Council that this will go. In a month's time, if it appears that Israel is in non-compliance with the court's orders, the court is likely to refer the matter to the Security Council. And then the United States and Britain and France will be put in the position. Do they enforce the decision of the ICJ, or do they support Israel in its defiance of it? Now, if they do the second, they risk further loss of international support, not just over the conflict in the Middle East, but generally with countries around the world saying, what kind of rules-based international order are the Western powers talking about when they insist that global South countries enforce an arrest warrant against President Putin of Russia because the Russians evacuated some children from a war zone and made arrangements thereafter whereby those children could be reunited with their families. Whereas a preliminary finding from the International Court of Justice that Israel might be in the process of perpetrating a genocide or might be in the process of allowing a genocide to take place, well, that kind of judgment by a court superior to the International Criminal Court, at least older and with a stronger jurisprudence than the International Criminal Court, a finding like that would have been made and the Western powers would be defying it. I cannot imagine a worst possible outcome. It would seem to me that at that point, whatever residual credibility the so-called rules-based international order still had would have gone up in smoke. Furthermore, it's highly likely that if the Western powers, the United States and Britain first and foremost, try to stop action being taken through the Security Council to enforce the ICC's decisions, that the BRICS countries will then take the matter to the General Assembly. And here I would say straight away that South Africa, being itself a BRICS country, I have no doubt that this application that South Africa made to the ICJ was coordinated by South Africa with the other BRICS countries, and that they have already probably prepared their next move. So the BRICS countries will probably take the case to the General Assembly, and the danger for the United States and Britain and the other Western powers and for Israel is that they will ask the General Assembly to refer Israel's case to the International Criminal Court. there will be a formal referral by the General Assembly to the International Criminal Court. Now, I am not convinced, in fact, I'm sure, that the General Assembly does not actually have the authority to do that. The Rome Statute contains no provision whereby the General Assembly can refer a case to the International Criminal Court. But the Western powers are in no position to argue that the General Assembly does not have that power, because last year and in 2022, they were intensively lobbying countries from the global south to support precisely that, a referral by the General Assembly of Russia to the International Criminal Court. What they found is that most countries in the global south were not prepared to do that, and that was why that idea was eventually abandoned, and the International Criminal Court was persuaded, in breach of the Rome Statute, to act unilaterally and to issue an indictment without a referral being made. But having lobbied just a short time ago the General Assembly to refer Russia to the ICC, they can't very well turn round and object now if the General Assembly refers Israel to the ICC. And if that happens, given that the ICJ has already found that there is a prima facie case that a genocide is being perpetrated in Gaza, and given that the ICJ has also said that there is evidence that war crimes are being committed, it will be very difficult indeed for the ICC, if it is to retain credibility, not to issue its own indictments against Israeli officials, the Israeli officials who have been making the kind of comments that I have been talking about. And if we get into that situation, then we will have an epic debacle on our hands. How, in that case, could those officials travel to Europe and not be arrested? What happens then? How does the European Union and the United States and Britain continue to justify their calls for the rigorous enforcement of the ICC warrant against President Putin, and at the same time seek to sabotage the ICC warrants against Israeli officials if they are issued? But of course, it goes beyond even this, because since we now have a judicial finding that there is a prima facie case that genocide is being committed, there is now a compelling argument that the Security Council should act to preserve peace, which is its function, by taking steps to stop that genocide from taking place. And if the Security Council is not prepared to do that, because the United States and Britain are willing to exercise their vetoes to prevent it happening, then suddenly we start to see how the logic of the General Assembly taking things into its own hands by taking steps under Chapter 7, using the authority of the Protecting for Peace, Uniting for Peace provisions, how that logic starts to take hold. Now, that might be a little far into the future, but we are much closer to that point than I think many people understand. Firstly, the last General Assembly vote on a ceasefire saw a significant increase in the number of countries that are now supporting a ceasefire. It went up, according to my memory, from 121 to I think it was 153. At the recent meeting of the Security Council, where the situation in Gaza was discussed, which was attended by 60 countries, the mood was overwhelmingly in favour of a ceasefire, with countries like Slovenia, France, Malta, and Switzerland appearing to talk in its support. So, this is starting now to come together in an alarming way, at least alarming if you are in the government of the United States and in Israel. And what is extraordinary, and again baffling to me, it was all totally foreseeable. And if you doubt that, all I would suggest is that you go back and watch the various programs that I have been making on this channel and the programs which we have been making on the Duran, not just myself and Alex Christoforou, but certain of our guests as well, and see what we've been saying almost from the moment that this current crisis began. To repeat again, this has been a failure of leadership by Israel, certainly, but then Israel is in a particularly difficult position. And you can perhaps make, well, I'm not going to say excuses, but anyway, explanations for the way they have acted. But still more so for those Western governments, the United States, Germany, and Britain, first and foremost, that claim to be Israel's friends and allies. Through their passivity, their lack of understanding and imagination, they have landed themselves and Israel in what could turn out to be an extremely difficult position. Now, just to say once more, none of this is surprising. None of this is unplanned. South Africa is a BRICS country. The BRICS states have been clearly working together in the Security Council. The Brazilians and the Russians have been proposing draft resolutions, which they've clearly agreed with each other. Saudi Arabia is now also, in effect, a BRICS state, and it's putting together a peace plan, which is clearly backed by the other BRICS states. It is not something that has come out of the blue, out of nowhere. It has clearly been carefully planned and coordinated. And that makes it even more baffling to me that the Western powers failed to see it. If you want further proof that the foreign policy leaderships of the Western states at the moment are unfit for purpose, then this slowly gathering debacle ought to be the final proof. Anyway, we will see what will happen. My guess is that Israel has about a month to try to find some sort of rational response. We've already had splenetic comments from Ben Gvir, the security minister, who's already making incredible comments about the ICJ, which, to be very clear, are reckless and unwise. We've already heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu, words of defiance. One would like to think that people would act intelligently and rationally, not just in Jerusalem, but also first and foremost in Washington. That the Biden administration would now finally take a grip on the problem and understand that its entire policy approach since October has been a slow motion disaster. But I'm sorry to say, I doubt that will happen. We will probably get more of the same. We will probably get a wider war in the Middle East, all of which will, of course, make all of these problems, which we already have, even worse. Anyway, that's where I'm going to stop in discussing this momentous decision by the ICJ. Now I'm going to turn to this other question, which is this crisis that's blown up over the issue of the border and the apparent defiance by Texas of a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I am not, by any stretch, any sort of expert in US constitutional law. So I am not going to try to second guess the judgment of the Supreme Court of the United States. I am not in a position to say whether that decision was right or whether it was wrong. And of course, as somebody who's had a legal background, I would say that in any event, I don't think it's appropriate for lawyers to come along and say, well, the decision of the Superior Court is wrong. Lawyers are supposed to be people who, as officers of the court, uphold its decisions. So I'm just saying all of this. I'm not anyway sufficiently expert to say what this decision was. But this decision, it seems to me, has created a massive political problem for the President of the United States, who is President Biden. And the reason that this has happened is because it has come precisely at the point when it has become clear to everyone that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican Party's nominee for the president, for the president of the United States in the forthcoming election in November. And President Trump has made the border, the situation on the border, a central issue of his campaign. And in doing so, of course, he is talking about an issue that clearly concerns many Americans. In fact, probably most Americans. So, given that this is so, given that President Trump, or rather former President Trump, candidate Trump, is making a big issue of immigration, given that President Biden is going to be Donald Trump's opponent in the election in November, again, it seems to me it is too late now for the Democratic Party to put up an alternative candidate. It is very easy to see how, if Texas continues in its defiance, President Biden is in a very difficult position about what to do. Does he take control of Texas, the Texas National Guard, perhaps send other federal forces into Texas, declare, who knows, maybe an insurrection there, in order to take down the border wire on the border at precisely the time when most Americans believe that there is a crisis on the border. I would have thought that if President Biden were to do that, it would play directly into former President Trump's, candidate Trump's agenda for the election. He would say that President Biden is more keen on letting people into the United States, and he's prepared to trample on the states, in this case Texas, in order to do that. And it isn't, of course, just a case of Donald Trump, because it is now clear that the entire Republican Party is closing ranks with Texas. Most of the states apparently have now, at least the states with Republican governors, have come out in support of Texas. And I understand that Texas also has strong support amongst Republicans in Congress. So, what does President Biden do? Well, I think he will nonetheless press ahead and do that. In other words, he will federalize the National Guard and take some other steps to bring the wire on the border down. I can't really see how he can do anything else. A more supple politician than Joe Biden, a Bill Clinton, say, would probably have found a way round. He would probably have contacted Governor Abbott in Texas, invited him round to the White House, wined and dined him in some way, and they might have come together with a particular compromise after, well, Bill had called in Mitch McConnell and the others in Congress and got them all to have this convivial chat to sort things out together. That isn't President Biden's style, and to be straightforward about it, I don't think he has the skills to do something like that. He's already very unwisely given Texas a 24-hour ultimatum. And knowing Biden's personality, I think he will be afraid that he will look weak if he doesn't act according to that ultimatum after it has passed. So I think we will get a confrontation with Texas. Now, there are all sorts of people who are saying that this is the beginning of the end of the United States, that the people of Texas, the government of Texas, will resist this invasion. They will defy the federal government. I would say that in most other countries, that would probably be true. I think in the United States, the overriding loyalty that exists to the United States is still strong enough, and the loyalty to the Constitution of the United States is also strong enough to prevent that happening. But I will say that this is a dangerous game which is being played. My own view is that Abbott, under intense protest, will submit to what the federal government is going to do. I say that because I don't think that he really plans for secession, Texas's secession from the United States or anything like that, and nor does the larger Republican Party. I think that from the Republican Party's point of view, from Donald Trump's point of view, the best outcome would be allowing Biden to come in, trample over the rights of Texas, and take the fence down. Then Trump can say, and Republicans can say, well, if you want that fence to go up again, there's only one way you can do that, and that is by voting Donald Trump back into the White House. So I think that is what will happen. But let me repeat again, I do think that this is a very dangerous game that is being played. I hope and believe that everything will hold and that people know how far to go. I'm not 100% certain that that is the case, and we shall see. But I'm going to assume for the moment that they do, and on that basis, I'm going to continue with the rest of my analysis. And I'm going to say this, which is that, in my opinion, this action, this case, this decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, taken together with Donald Trump's victories in Iowa and New Hampshire, have probably significantly reduced the prospects of Congress authorizing more financial aid for Ukraine. And the reason is this: Donald Trump is making immigration a central plank of his election campaign. He will not want a shabby compromise, what he will see as a shabby compromise, being agreed between Republicans in Congress and the White House to authorize financial aid for Ukraine. He will argue, correctly, that whatever concessions on the border President Biden appears willing to make will not be substantive and cannot be relied upon. And he will tell Republicans in Congress, if you make that kind of shabby compromise, you are betraying me, your candidate for the presidency, because you will be undermining my major pitch, which is that I am the man who can sort out this crisis on the border. Obviously, if you do a deal with Biden, you're in effect saying that the crisis on the border is not so bad, that the Biden administration's policies are not so bad, and you will give some traction to whatever claim Biden makes, that the situation on the border is under control, because after all, the Republicans in Congress have agreed to that. So I think that makes it less likely that Republicans will agree to a deal on the issue of the border. And I have to say that if the Biden administration does what I expect it to do, take control of the situation in Texas and bring down the wire, take down the wire, then that is going to make it even more difficult, I would say all but impossible, for Republicans in Congress to then go ahead and do a deal with Biden over the situation on the border. How can they do a deal with a president to tighten control on the border if that very same president is taking the border wire down? I can't see how even someone with the skill and dexterity of Mitch McConnell can find his way around that. So I don't think there's going to be an agreement on the border issue. And I don't think myself that there's going to be, I'm increasingly coming around now to the view that there isn't going to be an agreement on the situation over Ukraine. Because if the Republicans, having linked the issue of funding for Ukraine with the border, now separate these two questions and say, well, we can't agree on the border, but let's nonetheless vote funding for Ukraine. And again, of course, they have reversed themselves and they are going against candidate Trump's express wishes. He says he doesn't want to see more funding for Ukraine. And I don't think that they're going to do that. I think even Mitch McConnell understands this. He's now addressed members of the Senate. He's basically said that the whole dynamic of everything has changed. And I think that he has quietly accepted that funding for Ukraine, for the moment at least, is simply not an available option. Now, all of this may change. I do not underestimate Mitch McConnell's skills. I think he remains as committed to funding for Ukraine as always. At least that's what he wants to see happen. But at the same time, I don't think he wants to lose complete control of the Republican Party to Donald Trump. I certainly don't think he wants to be replaced as leader of the Republicans in the Senate by J.D. Vance. And I think he understands that if he now makes concessions to Biden at this particular point in time over the border and over Ukraine, then he risks doing precisely that to himself. So, on the issue of Ukraine, I'm not saying this is always so. I'm not saying definitely that Congress will not at some point authorize some funding for Ukraine. But my sense is that this decision of the Supreme Court, this crisis over Texas, has combined to make it less likely. Now, just to finish on Ukraine itself, I understand, I think I touched on this in a recent video, that EU countries, increasing numbers of them, are getting cold feet about seizing the Russian assets. And of course, if that is correct, then it is likely that at some point over the next couple of months, Ukraine will indeed run out of funds and we will see a deepening crisis in Ukraine. But I'm going to return to that in future programs. The very last thing I'm going to return to is the Supreme Court of the United States and what happened there. As I said, I don't want to second guess this decision of the Supreme Court. I don't have the technical skill to do that. I don't know well enough the underlying law. I certainly don't know the jurisprudence. All I will say is this. Once again, this decision, which is a 5-4 decision, seems to have been made because Chief Justice Roberts once more exercised or executed this strange policy of legal transformismo, which he performs on the Supreme Court. He seems to think that in a deeply polarized political environment, such as the one that the United States is in now, sometimes tilting a little to the left and sometimes tilting a little to the right, is the way to keep the Supreme Court free of controversy. Now, this might help from time to time, but like transformismo, wherever it is practiced, transformismo is trying to run everything from the center. What it ends up doing is exasperating people from every point of view and increasing polarization. And we can see how this is apparently happening with this particular decision. It might have been intended to give the liberal wing of the Supreme Court and of opinion, public opinion in the United States, a bone to set off perhaps against the overturning of Roe and Wade. But all it has done is inflame tensions even further and perhaps trigger a political crisis, the results of which it's not at all easy to know. Well, I'm going to finish my program at this point. I'm going to go and nurse my voice. I hope by tomorrow I'll be back again and able to speak properly. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, X, Locals, and X Locals and Rumble. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Check out our shop. Check that you subscribe to this channel. Tick the like button. And all that's left is for me to wish you a good day.